zum letzten Teil, zum letzten Vortrag des Symposiums. I will switch to English now in order to welcome and present to you our final speaker of the day, Terence McKiernan. Terence McKiernan is the head of Bishop Accountability, an archive that has already been mentioned by Ute in her talk. It is the world's largest independent archive on clergy sex abuse in the Catholic Church. As head of that archive, Terence McKiernan is also one of the leaders of a research project funded by the University of Notre Dame. The title of that project is Gender, Sex and Power Towards a History of Clergy Sex Abuse in the US Catholic Church. And I have the honor to be a member of that research group. And I can tell you that Terence McKiernan has been incredibly supportive and helpful to all of us, all our colleagues working in that project. His lecture today bears the title Clergy Abuse Sources, the US Experience in Global Perspective. And I give a very warm welcome to Terence McKiernan. And Terry, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Doris. Many thanks to the department for sponsoring this symposium, and a special thanks to the translator. I apologize that I'm not talking to you in German, and I'm very grateful to her for translating all of the talks today for me and translating me back to you. So let me very briefly say a little bit more about Bishop Accountability and then get to work here. So the thing I would like to highlight, and what's important, I think, in the Notre Dame project, is that we have gathered more than 240,000 pages of public church files and made them available to scholars. In addition to that, we have over 1 million pages of church archives that we are curating for eventual release. We maintain a database of accused priests in the United States that now has 7,400 priests, brothers, sisters, deacons, and seminarians in it, and that database is still growing. We also have databases on Argentina, Chile, Ireland, and we'll be adding Mexico next year. We're also building a library of oral histories, which I think is very important, and especially important when it's difficult to obtain documents, as it seems to be in Germany and many other countries. And lastly, we have a complete set of what in the United States is called the Official Catholic Directory. I think in Germany, it's a series, diocese by diocese, called the Schematismus. We find this incredibly useful for building career histories of priests, and also spotting priests to watch because of telltale signs in the directories. And I would think that a project to gather all of those in Germany and begin to work on them as a data source would be very, very valuable. Perhaps that's happening already. Now, scholars have used bishopaccountability.org really from its inception, but as Doris mentioned, the Gender, Sex, and Power project at Notre Dame has allowed us to systematize our amateur archive and to learn more about how we can help scholars to use it well. And I would very much like to extend that invitation to everyone here in the symposium. If you would like to see a sample file that we have, if you have a particular topic that you'd like to ask me to locate a file for you and share it with you, I would be absolutely delighted to do that. So back to this 240,000 pages, I'm going to share my screen and So this is a list of the archives that comprise that 240,000 pages. And I'll work with Doris to put this online on our website so all of you can see it. So there's no need to try to read all the small print now. But I wanted to say a word about how this has been assembled. In the United States, archives are really not consulted as you have described in this amazing afternoon, but really liberated by civil production in civil suits and by subpoenas in criminal investigations. And these archives, especially the large ones, generally come from seminary records, personnel records, secret archive files, and then laicization records. By no means do all of the priest files have all of those elements, but many of them have many of them. What I'd like to do here is, first of all, give you a very quick history of the crisis, quote unquote, in the United States. Then talk for a moment about survivors and archives. Then describe some of the problems that we encounter in the transmission of these files into their public state, and then finish by talking a little bit about reading the files. And I hope I can finish quickly enough so that we'll have ample time for questions and conversation. So you could simplify the history of the abuse crisis and the release of files in the United States perhaps to these 8 steps, and I'll go through them very quickly. It all started, is the mythology, in 1984 with the Goethe case in the Lafayette Diocese. And this case was important because it was the first one to be national in the United States. It's also the first one to bring to public awareness the great journalist Jason Berry, who wrote a book about this and other early cases and other books, and is still writing journalism about the crisis all these years later. It also brought to prominence Tom Doyle, who was working at the nunciature at the time and became an expert witness and wrote a report with some colleagues in 1985 that was the benchmark really in the United States, because it was sent to every single sitting bishop in the United States and described the crisis. Around the same time up in Minnesota, this case was important because it was the one that got Jeff Anderson involved in the abuse crisis. And Anderson is still one of the leading attorneys, and so many of the archives that we are able to gather and present came from his good work. Then in Chicago, in Illinois, the Meyer case, which actually started in 1983, but really broke in 1991 when Meyer was transferred to another parish, was very, very important in the crisis in the United States because it was the occasion for the founding of 2 survivors organizations, the Link Up, which was founded by Gene Miller, and the Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests, which was founded by Barbara Blaine, the late Barbara Blaine. So that one case really, and the attention that was devoted to it, is in many ways the reason why there is a robust survivors movement in the United States to the present day. In 1992, the Porter case was very important for us here because although Porter was originally a Massachusetts priest, he was sent to the Servants of the Paraclete in the Archdiocese of Santa Fe for treatment and was sent to parishes in that archdiocese to work and reoffended there. That was back in the 60s, and when all of this broke in the early 90s, the crisis in the United States went national in a way that it really had not been before. Later in the 90s, the Koss case in the Dallas diocese was significant because the jury decided on a $119 million award for the abuse of a group of victims. And that astonishing award, although it was reduced subsequently, got the bishop's attention, I think, in a way that nothing else had. Then, of course, in 2002, the Boston Globe's story, because the internet had matured enough, prompted other stories all over the country and really all over the world. And other investigations, including grand jury investigations, were started as a result. The bishops met in Dallas to finally, to some extent, deal with the crisis in the United States. The charter and norms were approved, and zero tolerance was chosen as particular law for the United States, a thing that I think is still significant and really ought to be the case in the entire world, but still is not. Then the McCarrick case in 2018 finally, I think, shifted attention to the accountability of bishops after so much attention being paid in the wake of the Dallas meeting to priests. And the energy of that was further magnified by the Pennsylvania grand jury report, which completed the suite of grand jury reports for that state and shocked people in the United States more than anything had since 2002. So that's a little potted history of where we are, in case our history is unfamiliar to you. The reason the Pennsylvania grand jury report, I think, in part was so effective is because it embedded documents like this photograph of a crucifix that one of the accused priests in Pennsylvania used to mark his victims so that other priests could abuse them too. It was those kinds of impactful details that really account for the power of the Pennsylvania grand jury report. I'd like to pause for a second and say how moved I was by the afternoon session, which combined, I felt, the passion of survivors and the message that archives are so essential to all of this in one few hours. It was an incredible experience to be present for those presentations. Along those lines, I'd like to pause for a moment and acknowledge the passing of Phil Saviano, who brought those two qualities together in his life. He was a survivor of abuse by a priest named David Hawley. He filed suit against the Worcester Diocese in the state of Massachusetts to obtain Hawley's files, because it was the only way that he could do it, and refused a confidentiality clause in his settlement exactly because he wanted to use those documents and he wanted to talk with survivors, organize them, and become an effective activist in the United States. This is early 90s when very little of this was happening. And I feel strongly that uncomfortable as the activist part of the movement is for some people, it's a package deal. The activism and the attention to archives go together, it seems to me, in a very important way. So Phil is an activist, as you see in this photograph, and he was also an archivist. In the wonderful collection of documents that Jan has curated, there is this astonishing document from Phil's collection that shows how the Diocese of Worcester, calculated the transfer of a priest they knew to be an offender, cold-bloodedly calculated when it was time to move him from the diocese because the diocese was, quote unquote, too compact for him to remain there anymore. And their rationale was that he needed to go elsewhere. So Phil is a hero in all of this, and we miss him. Now, that list of documents that I showed you, there's some depletion that occurs before they even become public. One that's been mentioned during the sessions today is shown in this document from the Bishop of Manchester, which is New Hampshire in the United States, to the head of the Servants of the Paraclete, saying, "I will, as you request, destroy the various psychological reports you included." And there are many other examples of documents being destroyed before they can be obtained either in a civil suit or in prosecutions. So we're already dealing with an archive that isn't the total archive. Then, of course, there are manifold redactions, and this makes the documents difficult to work with, as we all know. There's also a process, at least here in the United States, of compiling what's known as a privilege log. This is page 1 of a privilege log that runs to 27 pages, listing all the documents that the church lawyers wanted excluded from a document release. Nevertheless, this particular file was still 1,500 pages long. The Chicago archive has a very strange feature. They have replaced all of the victim statements and testimony with summaries like this. And this apparently was something that church lawyers and lawyers for the survivors agreed on, but it really diminishes the survivor's voice in that very large archive. Okay, so let's talk about reading these documents in a little bit of detail. We're going to first, and again, these 4 documents that you'll see, I'm not going to pause and read them through, are available in the symposium exhibition of documents. This is a series of documents in the John Gagan file in the Boston Archive. And it shows how, I'll just summarize them, how the Institute of Living, which is a treatment center in Connecticut, provided a discharge summary that was unfavorable for John Gagan. And an auxiliary bishop in Boston wrote back and said, that's really not the result that we wanted, because we wanted to put this priest back into ministry, and you've advised that we not do that, and that wasn't really what we were expecting. And the Institute of Living wrote back and said, so sorry, we really didn't mean to say that. We do think that it is both reasonable and therapeutic at the end of that first paragraph for him to be reassigned back to his parish. And the auxiliary bishop, who would become the Bishop of Green Bay shortly thereafter, writes back and says, thank you very much for complying. Now this shows that quote unquote treatment is a very fraught subject. And I think it's probably true in Germany and in Europe as it is in the United States. I don't think that this kind of ruthless control exercised over supposedly independent psychological assessments is always happening in the United States or always happened in the United States. But there is always, I think, a kind of wink and nod between the bishop who needs certain things done and the treatment centers who frankly depend on his business. And the children, of course, are the ones who suffer. Let's look at a small selection of extraordinary documents. This one you've seen already, and I'd like to read it through. So this is one of those victim statement abstracts that come from the Chicago archive. This abstract replaces a letter written by the mother of victim AD on or about July 20th, 2002, describing Father Raymond Scriba's inappropriate conduct with her child in 1992 at St. Joseph's Parish. The letter states that when victim AD was 7 years old, she was asked by Father Scriba during confession inappropriate questions, such as whether victim AD ever masturbated when she was alone, this at age 7. Here's another document about the same event, which provides a little bit more information and then has a huge redaction in the middle. I asked her why, and she said she didn't like the things she had to talk about in confession with Father Scriba, indicating, it seems to me, that this is a repeating problem, not a single event. And then from a different archive completely, assembled by a woman who's actually on our board, we find a much more humane presentation of this case, and I'd like to read this section too. The victim's mother, who asked to remain anonymous, said her daughter was a student at St. Joseph's School at the time. She came home crying, saying that she did not want to go to confession anymore, and that she didn't want to be a Catholic, the mother said. The girl told her mother Scriba had said things to her during confession. He asked her if she ever masturbated. The mother said, "I know she didn't make it up because she was 7 years old, and that was not a word she had heard at home." The family says they reported this to school authorities at the time. They told us that she was just making it up and that Father Scriba had a good reputation, the mother said. As far as I know, he never laid a hand on her. But as far as we're concerned, what he did is just as bad. And that final sentence is, I think, important because it reveals that these standards that seem to be advantageous are often not enough in the recent church arrangements supposedly to deal with these problems. And it also reveals, I think, the deficiency of these archives, that an article in a local newspaper can capture the humanity of a situation so much more deeply and accurately than these church documents do. And yet, I think there's room in the church documents for the revelations that we need. For example, in the Los Angeles Archdiocese, one has a sense that we get a little closer to the personality of Cardinal Roger Mahony, who ran the Archdiocese, of course, for many years. His method of handling the management of his chancery was to handwrite responses and orders for action at the bottom of the memos that he received. And as a result, you get a sense of the man's personality, for better or worse, that you don't get, for example, in the Philadelphia archive, where Cardinal Anthony Bevilacqua had things strictly organized and is nearly invisible, really, in the archdiocese that he actually controlled. So this is the impression you get from this document, and yet This is a different archive entirely. In 2002, a radio station in Los Angeles received a leaked collection of emails from Mahony's chancery. And in this document, you see Mahony, RMM at the bottom, writing to a passel of lawyers at the top, 3 outside lawyers, 1 internal lawyer who's a religious sister, Sister Judy Murphy. And they are basically strategizing how to evade the LAPD, the Los Angeles Police Department, which is investigating abuse cases. And yet the cheery kind of tone of the note is very similar to the document that we just looked at. We definitely have to get ourselves to July 1st. Thanks for the input. And one has the dismaying sense that this is all a shell game, and that within that outer shell of personal management of the archdiocese, we have this inner shell where Mahony is strategizing with his lawyers to deceive the police about the abuse of children. Contrast that with this letter. Now, this is a letter from a woman abused by a priest named Neville Rucker, also in the Los Angeles Archdiocese. And she's writing to the priest himself. After attending a workshop, I won't read the whole thing, but let me read a bit of it. After attending a workshop in March 1990 on the sexual misconduct of professional ministers presented by the Archdiocese of Seattle, she was a religious sister at the time, a deep wound and scar surfaced in me, for which you are responsible. The image and memory have not diminished through the years, as you might think, nor has the cross I bear lessened in time. On the contrary, as each year passes, I am now 50, I realize and feel more keenly the impact of sexual abuse. The sexual abuse you inflicted upon me when I was just a little child has and will remain with me forever. It was a long time ago, though it sometimes feels like yesterday. The year 1947. I was 7 years old, just a little child. You were assisting at St. Alphonsus Parish in East Los Angeles. One day I was in the school cafeteria adjoining the parish auditorium. My mother was visiting with the lunchroom ladies. You knew my mother well. She drove the school bus and did some secretarial work in the rectory. Perhaps your relationship with her brought you into contact with me. Whatever the case may be, you took advantage of that connection by using me, and so forth. So the archives also have these kinds of astonishing documents. A survivor amazingly reaching out to her abuser in this way. And then, and this brings us back to a presentation from the morning session, Mary Dispenza, who was the woman involved, went on to write a really amazing memoir about her abuse, about her life as a religious sister, about how that life really began not to be the right one for her coming out as a gay woman. An amazing memoir that has its roots in one of these archives that we've collected and are able to share. I want to finish with one other example. I can't show the whole thing because Doris and I decided that it was really too much for a public session like this, but this is the beginning of a sexual autobiography written by a Franciscan priest named Van Handel, also in California. And it begins innocuously enough, and then page after page gets into troubling and difficult and disturbing and horrible detail about his abuse of boys at a minor seminary in Santa Barbara. These kinds of documents are not all that frequent in the archive, but they do occur where we hear, and I think we need to hear, the voices of the abusers as well as the voices of the abused. And then this extraordinary situation where one of his victims, Damien Eckert, sits down to read that document that I just showed you the beginning of. Now, this is not, as we were discussing in one of the morning sessions, a pact really between the author and the reader. It's perhaps an uneasy truce or maybe a revelation. Eckert opened a document, 27 pages, that Van Handel wrote for a therapist years ago, his so-called sexual autobiography. It made Eckert's palms sweat and his back knot. His in-laws poked their heads into the room. "Are you okay?" "Yes," he reassured them. And he continued to read. I wanted to end with this because I know this is an academic session. You know, I'm a guerrilla archivist, but I'm not an academic. And I think it is good for all of us to remember that as we are struggling to read these documents, as we're struggling to use them, the survivors themselves of these perpetrators are struggling to read the documents too. And it does seem to me that we owe it to the survivors to use these documents and to use them well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Terry, for this so insightful presentation and for allowing us to see the same case from the angle of so many different documents. I think that is very enlightening. With my eyes on the watch and knowing that we are almost like 45 minutes behind the time, I would still invite everybody here present to ask any questions you may have. Use this unique opportunity to ask Terence McKiernan a question you may have concerning bishop accountability, concerning his projects and the files, because as we have seen, there are so huge differences between our situation in Germany and the situation in the United States when it comes to almost any aspect of how files are accessible, what kinds of files are accessible, and so forth. And you have heard the invitation Terence McKiernan extended to all of us to use his files. So maybe some of you would like to react to this and ask any questions. So here's one question asked by Astrid Meyer. A question, I just read it out to you, Terry. You can react, but I think it's actually not addressed at you, but you might have something to say to that. How can we have an organization like yours here in Germany?
I don't know, you know, this session has been a revelation for me, and I'm only beginning to understand your predicament, but also your opportunity. It does seem to me that, difficult as it is to acquire documents in Germany, it would be wonderful if the documents that people have acquired, have liberated, could be consolidated in some way. It does seem to me that Phil Saviano's example is an important one. I would imagine that there are survivors in Germany who have obtained documents in the course of their cases, and perhaps they could be consolidated as well. And last thought, ignorant thought perhaps, because documents are so difficult in Germany, I wonder whether oral histories are even more important, and whether a concerted organized effort to assemble oral histories and collect them is another way of skinning the cat, as we say in English.
Well, I guess thank you for that. I think obviously there's a huge, this is a huge and complex issue. But thank you for these first remarks. And I would like to ask you a question myself. You have described the long history of the abuse crisis in the United States and the long history also of bishop accountability. And I was wondering how much interest is there on the part of scholars and particularly theologians to work with your files, to work with the archive, to engage in reading them? Is that a kind of more recent phenomenon, like in the project funded by Notre Dame, or is that something that is much more common?
In the past, individual scholars have approached us and asked for different kinds of help, either for us to share our data with them for a writing project or to share documents. It's also happened the other way around. A scholar who was working on a book and acquired some documents that we didn't have very generously offered to share them with us. But my impression is that in the past, scholars at secular institutions felt that this was a Catholic problem that Catholic scholars must be busy solving, whereas Catholic scholars found it difficult to engage with this, either because they had their own inhibitions or because their institutions had inhibitions on the subject. It does seem to me that is changing. And I would say that that our colleague Kathy Cummings, who fought for this project that we're doing with Notre Dame, is having a really important effect. I think also Notre Dame and some other Catholic institutions in the United States are now beginning to do and sponsor scholarship on this. I think in part as a result of the Pennsylvania grand jury report. I think there was such anguish about those revelations that something broke through for Catholic scholars and Catholic institutions.
Yes, thank you very much. I think that is something we see here in Germany with regard to the MHG study that also created a kind of urge in scholars to work on this topic more.
Yeah.
So a final encouragement to our colleagues here, if somebody would like to ask a question. If not, I take this as the proof that you all have very urgent matters to, again, looking at the watch, and we have now 20 minutes past 4. So I very warmly, again, thank Terence McKiernan